Welcome to the Minnesota Association for College Admission Counseling Virtual College Fair. We're so excited to have you with us this evening. We have a great panel planned for you on paying for college and financial aid. My name is Christopher, and I'll be the facilitator for this session. Before we get started with our presentations, just a few quick housekeeping items to go over. The first is that your camera and microphone are off, so the panelists will not be able to see or hear you. Attendees are welcome and certainly encouraged to ask questions at any time utilizing the Q&A feature. There are additional sessions. This is just the first of 3 days, so we'll be having 6x6 sessions where individual institutions are presenting about their schools, as well as more panels. So if you haven't signed up for those yet, please do so on the strivescan.com/Minnesota website. And also a recording of this session will also be available on that website. But at this point, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to our panelists. And up first, we're going to hear from Amy Harker from Iowa State.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Good evening and welcome everyone to our session on the financial aid process and really the basics of financial aid. So again, welcome. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us this evening. And we are going to go ahead and get started here momentarily. But while we do that, just a quick introduction of all of us as our panelists here this evening. My name is Amy Harker. I am one of the regional admissions counselors for Iowa State University. I am based here in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area and work with students specifically in the state of Minnesota and into Western Wisconsin as well. I've been in higher education for about 15 years. I've worked in both public settings and in smaller institutions and larger institutions like Iowa State. And I've also worked at private institutions, and I've worked both domestically and also with students internationally as well. So again, with all of our experience tonight, hopefully we can answer some great questions for all of you. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to introduce himself as well.
All right, well, thank you, Amy. Like Amy said, my name is Matt Henry. I'm one of the admission counselors who works regionally for North Dakota State University. Like Amy, I also work in the Twin Cities, Minnesota area, specifically kind of on the West Metro side of the Twin Cities. I've been doing this for a little bit over 4 years now. And before that, I was a college student at NDSU, graduated back in 2017. From here, I'll turn it over to Tara.
Great, thanks Matt and Amy. I'm Tara Malarkey. I'm a regional recruitment director for Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. I am also regionally based, but I am located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I work with students in Wisconsin and across the state of Minnesota. I've also been working in higher education in university admissions for about 10 years. Previously, I was at Marquette University in Milwaukee. So I have a lot of experience in private higher education, especially Jesuit education as well. So we will go ahead and turn it back to Amy and get started with our presentation. Thanks for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tara. So if you won't mind and just give me 1 second here, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with all of you. So hopefully you can see our presentation here on, like I said, getting started with paying for college and the basics of financial aid. So with that, the first thing I want for us to discuss and talk about this evening is really the primary goal of financial aid. So number one, I think for many of you, my guess is on this call this evening, you're here because you have some concerns and want to better understand how you are going to pay for your education, or maybe if you're a parent here joining us this evening, of how you're going to help assist your student in paying for their college education. So the number one goal, first of all, that we hope that you all understand is that the goal of financial aid is to assist students with that process, okay? So just again, want to make sure that that's clear. So just to kind of set the stage for the presentation and the evening here tonight, we want everyone to also understand that everyone's situation is different. So for all of you students on the call here tonight, your situation is going to be different than someone sitting next to you. If you know that you're applying to an institution with 5 of your friends, my guess is that each of you will probably pay something slightly different, maybe significantly different, depending on where you're paying at each of those institutions. So just know that. The other thing that I think is really important for all of us to understand is that education is absolutely an investment. Again, education is expensive. That's unfortunately the reality of it, but it is an investment, and it is also something that cannot be taken away from you. It is something that once you earn that college degree, you will always have that. So with that, I think it's important for all of us to understand, before we really kind of break things down and get into the nitty-gritty of paying for college, is to really understand the 4 primary types of financial aid, and really that financial aid process. So the first one that we want to talk about this evening is scholarships. So some of you have maybe heard of the term scholarship, some of you maybe haven't. Some of you that have heard the term may not necessarily know what it means or understand what that means for you. So what I first want to talk about is kind of defining these 4 things. So scholarships. Scholarships would be money that would be given to you that you would not need to pay back. Okay, so obviously scholarships are a great thing, because again, if that's money that's given to you that you don't need to pay back, that's gonna affect your overall cost to go to schools, to go to college. Grants are something, again, that's similar to scholarships in the fact that that could be money that would be given to you that, again, you would not need to pay back. Oftentimes, grants also can come from the federal government, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how you may be eligible for those. But again, grants would not be money that you would not need to pay back for your education. Loans. So that's going to be the opposite of scholarships and grants, and the fact that loans are something that if you are given loans, that is money that you will need to pay back once you stop going to school. And make note of that I did say stop going to school. And so what that means is that if you quit college, unfortunately, that means that you are going to have to pay those loans back. So it doesn't just mean that once you graduate from college, that money will need to be paid back. But again, once you stop going to school, that is money that is lended to you that will need to be paid back. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about loans momentarily, but then the last one that we're going to connect on here in more detail tonight is that 4th piece, is really that employment component of paying for college. And so certainly that could be made up of, a part-time job that you have while you're in college, part-time jobs that you have now. Maybe you work more full-time in the summer and save some of that money to help you pay for school. And then part of that is also something called work study, which would be employment that you'd have on campus for students that are eligible. And again, we'll get a little bit more into those details here momentarily as well. But the other thing I do want to point out before we kind of move on here to this next slide is understanding that this combination of scholarships, grants, loans, and employment, and whatever combination you have as an individual, it likely will not cover everything. And so I think that's, we want to be positive and educational here this evening, but we also want to be very realistic for all of you within your college search and paying for school. So the reality is that for most students, there is what we may call as a gap or an out-of-pocket expense for many families. Okay, so moving on from there, as what I briefly mentioned, kind of some tools and talked a little bit about kind of the grant piece and loans. And so a key piece of that is something called the FAFSA. And if we were in person and standing in front of you, I'd have you raise your hands right now and indicate how many of you have heard of the FAFSA. Some of you, again, likely have, some of you maybe have not, and that's okay. The FAFSA, I can tell you, stands for the Free Application of Federal Student Aid. So free is a key word there. So I do want to make sure this, again, for all of you to understand, this is it is something offered through the federal government. So it is a free application. You should never have to pay to submit, to complete or submit a FAFSA. Okay, so just want to make sure that you're aware of that. For my seniors that we have joining us this evening, is that I want to let you know this just opened. So it just opened on October 1st. So we're going to get into that a little bit more, but just kind of some exciting news there as well. So who should fill out the FAFSA? I'm going to tell you, as someone that's worked at multiple institutions, and I think I can speak on behalf of Matt and Tara for this, is that colleges really do recommend that all students applying to our institutions complete the FAFSA. So again, it's going to give us a better idea Based on what you fill out, that's also going to help us determine not only grants and loans, but also it may allow you to be eligible for additional funding from our specific institutions as well. So as far as who specifically needs to fill that out, you as the student, and then one of your parents will need to fill that out. Now I'm going to pause there because I know oftentimes at admissions, we get the question or we get a comment from parents and students that say, from maybe a student perspective that says, that's great, but my parents aren't going to help me. They have no intention of helping me. And or for parents to say, we don't plan to help our son or daughter with their education. And that is pretty common. That's certainly understandable, but unfortunately the federal government is still going to require a parent to fill that out as long as they claim you as a dependent student. So again, just to kind of clear that up as well. Great news though, when you are filling out the FAFSA is that it is something that you will only do it one time per year. So yes, as again, my seniors, we recommend that you do that this fall, you'll do it this fall, but then you also need to do it each year throughout your academic career at our institutions. The great thing for you, again, this year for our seniors is that you only fill it out once and you have the ability to submit that to multiple institutions at the same time. So again, really nice feature, only need to do it once. You can send it to multiple schools at the same time. So great feature there. So why should we fill it out? So again, it's going to help determine what you're eligible for through the federal government. So oftentimes there can be specific loans through the federal government and also some grants through the federal government for those that qualify. For loans, I do want to touch base briefly on that. I think oftentimes, it's something that we necessarily don't always want to do, but the reality is that is inevitable for many students in our country to help them pay for going to school. Loans through the federal government that you would apply for via the FAFSA are oftentimes the most advantageous loans and the best interest rates and best circumstances for many families. So again, if that's something that you're interested in, I know we get the question a lot, or I hear oftentimes from families, well, we don't think we're going to qualify for anything. And that may be the case. Maybe you won't qualify for any scholarships or grants through the federal government, but it doesn't mean that you wouldn't necessarily qualify for any loans. Okay, so just I want to kind of clarify that for all of you. So again, that is certainly something that we do encourage students to do. As I mentioned earlier too, based on filling out the FAFSA, that information will be sent directly to all of to the institutions you identify you want those to be sent to, and that will help us determine as well if you may be eligible for some additional funding to our specific institutions based on that information. Okay. So the next piece on the slide here is we're going to talk a little bit about the cost of attendance. So first of all, I want to just make kind of a general statement for those of you that are beginning your college searches and you're probably looking at college websites to determine what is the cost of attendance. My first tip or piece of advice there is to not judge a book by its cover and to not make a decision or rule out colleges at this point based on that cost of attendance based on those cost of attendance numbers that you're seeing on our websites. And the reason I say that is that very few students pay that number that you see on our websites. Okay. So again, just want to quickly mention that. And again, that's consistent for public, that's consistent for private, in-state, out-of-state institutions as well. So expected family contribution is something that you're going to probably hear that terminology. Part of what the federal government uses or determines is there's a formula the federal government uses to determine basically what they're estimating your family should be able to help contribute towards your education. Okay. Good or bad, as institutions, we do not make this up. The federal government does. So everyone is the same. Everyone is going to be treated equal here from that formula. So just to let you know that. But there are going to be different things that they're going to take a look at. So they're going to look at, incomes, assets that your family has. parent guardian contribution, how many family members that you do have. So I know sometimes I'll work with families that say, well, we are adding another student, or we have an older brother or sister, or next year we will have another student. And sometimes that can change things for you. Okay, so just to let you know that. Certainly the number of family within a household can make an impact as well. So those are just a couple of examples that you will see, though, when we're going through this, and that, again, through the federal government is going to help determine when you complete that FAFSA as far as what they expect that your family may be able to help contribute towards your child's education. The next thing on here is something called a net price calculator. And this is a tool that we all have on our websites to help determine and to give you a rough estimate of what it would cost to attend our institutions. Okay, I'm not going to get into the weeds on that because Tara is going to talk a little bit more in depth about the net price calculator shortly. But with that, I am going to turn it back over to Matt to take a deeper dive into the next components here for us this evening.
All right, thank you, Amy. Sorry for the pause there while I got unmuted. Hopefully you all can hear me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the timeline of financial aid. And granted, this is a pretty large topic that can go a lot of different ways depending on which schools you're applying for, and a lot of different things, really. But I think the first thing to note is something that Amy already mentioned. The FAFSA opens up on October 1st every year. Like she mentioned, it actually opened up just this past Friday. If you're a senior in high school right now and you plan to go to college next year, you can fill out the FAFSA with your family, parent, or guardian at this time. Now, if you're a junior, if you're a sophomore, if you still have a couple years before you're planning to go to college, this isn't something you need to worry about right now. But if you're planning on starting in fall of 2022, this is something that you can take care of. Now, that is when the FAFSA opens. Deadlines, though, are going to look a little bit different. Priority deadlines is something that colleges will use. And basically, the reason that colleges have priority deadlines is certain funds through the FAFSA are only available for a limited time. And that doesn't mean that there's necessarily a hard deadline on those awards. But a lot of times what it means is there's a particular pool of money, and as that money is awarded, less money is available. So those priority deadlines are set to help make sure that you are able to receive the most funding possible at each particular institution. So for example, NDSU's priority deadline is February 1st, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every college is going to have the same or a similar priority deadline. Some colleges will have their priority deadline in November, some will have them in December, January, and then, like I said, February. So this can get really complicated when you're trying to determine when you actually want to go through the process of submitting your FAFSA. So I think the easiest answer is submit it as soon as you're able to. But if you really want that deadline to help kind of ensure you're on the right timeline, the best thing I would suggest would be look at all of the different colleges that you are planning to apply to and find the earliest priority deadline. With the FAFSA, as Amy mentioned, you can send this to multiple colleges at once. And so I would suggest going with the earliest or the soonest or nearest priority deadline that you can find and submit the FAFSA by that point. Now, there's, I think, some other things too that a lot of times hold people off on the FAFSA. And generally something that we hear a lot is the FAFSA has been notoriously difficult to work with for many years. However, in recent years, there's been several different things that have been done to make it a little bit more simple for families who are going through the process. So a couple points that I have highlighted are prior, and then the IRS data retrieval tool. So prior is kind of a new method of how the FAFSA calculates your potential award. And basically what that means is if you're applying for something like, say, semester of fall 2022, it is going to look at your prior, so 2 years back, those tax returns. So this makes it a little bit easier. Before, it used to be that you would have to go in and re-update your FAFSA with new tax information, and you would get an estimate and then a final. This is a little bit simpler since we're using older information. Now, something else that's made it a little bit simpler, and I think is a really big benefit to students and families, is the IRS data retrieval tool. as someone who fills out the FAFSA regularly as practice, this has made the process a lot more simple for me. And for students and families, it should make the process a lot more simple for you. Basically, what this does is it pulls all the information from the IRS in order to help fill some of those fields within the FAFSA. That really kind of cuts down on the time that you'll probably be spending within this application. So that is something that I think is really helpful, and it kind of should alleviate some of those concerns you may have about doing this huge kind of large application. Now, beyond that, there's a couple other things I do want to mention. So although priority deadlines often line up to institution-specific deadlines, they are often going to be a little bit different. They might not be exact. And so what I mean by that is, although our priority deadline might be the same as a scholarship deadline, that might not be the deadline for admission, or there might be other deadlines at play. So it's really important that when you're applying to schools and you're applying for FAFSA, just keep in mind that these are kind of two separate processes, and you need to stay attentive to all the different deadlines that go into these processes. The last thing I want to touch on again is the financial aid offer letter. And Amy touched on this a little bit when she talked about making that final comparison. A lot of this information isn't fully available until around February or March of your senior year. These financial aid offer letters tend to go out around that time, and that's when you're going to be able to make those apples to apples comparisons between colleges and determine what is going to be the best fit for you financially. And Amy, if you want to go to the next slide, you can now. So obviously, this is a huge process. And we talked a little bit about the FAFSA, but I do want to touch on scholarships too, because scholarships are really probably the preferred or the ideal way to help pay for college. But a lot of times students don't really know where to start with these. And I know when I was a student, I had no idea where I should be looking. And so I think the first thing to mention is you want to try and start close to home. And so this graphic that is kind of detailed here should give you a good idea of how to organize your scholarship search. So you want to start in the center and look at scholarships that are available through the particular institutions that you're applying for. So if you're applying for particular colleges, see what sort of scholarship deadlines and opportunities that they have. And then your high school. Oftentimes your high school or community or school district may have awards available for you that you can apply for. And what's really nice about these awards is the amount of applicants tends to be a lot smaller than some of these other areas that you can apply for scholarships at. So it's really good to start there. But then from there, the next kind of big step would be going to the community and employers. So if you bank at a particular location, or your parents bank at a particular location, or maybe you have family members who work for a particular institution or a particular employer, there are often going to be scholarships available through those employers and through that community. And so that is the next kind of logical step in your scholarship search. The kind of final step in the scholarship search is going to these big databases. So a couple that we have listed here are fastweb.com and then collegeboard.com. These are really great locations that host a ton of different awards and are really great when you're trying to determine, how are you going to pay for these costs. But a lot of times there are many, many applicants. And the reason for this is some of these scholarships offer huge award amounts. So, $10,000 to $20,000 to $30,000 a year. And a lot of them are going to be really easy to apply for. Simply, put in your name, some basic information, and click submit. And so I just have a couple tips for that. When you're applying for scholarships, oftentimes it's going to be better to apply for the small niche awards that only offer, $500 to $1,000. While that doesn't look like it's going to make a huge dent up front, you want to try and treat the scholarship application process like a job. So think about the time you put in towards the potential award. So, of course, if you spend a couple hours doing the scholarship application and it's only for $1,000, if you receive that, that's $500 an hour. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're doing this search. Try and apply for those specific smaller awards first. And not necessarily go for those, massive sweepstakes awards that often these sorts of databases like to highlight. If you want to go to the next slide, Amy. All right. And so the last thing I wanted to talk about is kind of the funnel for how you should think about the process of paying for college, because there's so many different places that you can receive potential awards and so many different pools of money that you can draw from. But I think a lot of times students don't know and families don't necessarily know of, kind of what the order of what they should be looking at is. So the first kind of primary source of revenue or awards that you might want to take a look at, of course, would be scholarships. And these are, available in a lot of different ways, some of the different things that I highlighted in the previous slide. But from there, the next kind of logical step would be looking at the FAFSA and some of those awards that don't require repayment. So grants and work study. Now, something to note, grants are usually given upfront. Work study is usually not. So you usually have to spend time working that semester to earn a particular amount of money. So just keep that in mind. That might not necessarily fulfill that cost right up front. From there, you might want to start taking a look into your savings, checking into getting a part-time job over the summer, or working additional hours to help pay for additional costs. And this is kind of the next step that I would suggest going with. Beyond that, there's kind of two final areas that you would kind of look to draw from to help pay for your college experience. The next one that we would usually suggest would be the loans available through the FAFSA, the unsubsidized and subsidized loans. And then the last step would be those private loans. Now, private loans aren't inherently bad. They're not a last ditch resort. But a lot of times, the loans available through the FAFSA are going to have lower interest rates. They're maybe a little bit easier for you to work with. And the process of applying is going to be a lot simpler through the FAFSA than some of these private loans may be. So that's generally the order that we would recommend. But of course, each individual might go through a little bit of a different process, but this is a good kind of general overview of where to start and where to end.
Great, thanks, Matt. So I know this is a ton of information, especially for you seniors that are planning to apply to colleges now. You're starting to look at the cost of all the different types of schools you're applying to and all of the different deadlines. There is certainly a lot to keep straight, and there's a lot to sort through. But some of the things I really want to make sure that we touch on, that we have families and students consider, is if you're a senior and applying to these colleges now, there's different processes that different schools use to award financial aid or to determine your out-of-pocket cost that you're going to owe to that particular institution. So it's helpful to know that there are lots of different kinds of colleges and universities. There's over 3,000 colleges and universities in this country alone, and we're all different in many different ways. But a couple of big differences are public and private schools. So typically public universities and public colleges are funded by the federal government or state governments, so that residents of the United States or residents of a particular state can go to that institution paid for by tax dollars. There are lots of caveats to that as well, because if you are a resident of that state, typically you can go to that school for in-state tuition. But if you are not a resident of that state and you want to go, so if you are a resident of Minnesota and you're interested in Iowa State or in NDSU, those are technically out-of-state schools, but they are state institutions for the students that live in North Dakota and in Iowa. So being a resident of a state makes a difference, but being an out-of-state student makes a difference as well. Some colleges and universities offer reciprocity, which is a word you might hear a lot when looking at particular state universities. So there is reciprocity available with some Minnesota students at North Dakota schools and Wisconsin schools, but not reciprocity available for students at Iowa schools. So basically what that means is if you're a resident of Minnesota, if you have reciprocity, you might be treated as an in-state student to pay in-state tuition at that university. It's a lot to consider. I certainly understand it can get really, really overwhelming. So I highly encourage, if you're interested in a particular school, definitely reach out to that college or university to see how your situation may be viewed. Private institutions, on the other hand, are colleges and universities that are funded by tuition dollars. They might be funded by a religious order, they might be funded by larger organizations, but typically they're funded by tuition dollars. And so there is no difference for in-state or out-of-state tuition. Every student would pay, or the cost of attendance is the same for every student, regardless of where you're coming from. Private institutions, however, though typically they have a higher cost of attendance, might be able to offer specific institutional-based aid, whether or not that's based on your need and your FAFSA or based on additional endowed and funded scholarships. So at Xavier University, where I work, we have over 20 private scholarships that students can apply for that are specific to incoming students at Xavier, but we also offer significant merit-based scholarship based on the application that you submit when you're applying for our institution. On top of that, we also, separate from the federal government, we also offer need-based aid based on the expected family contribution from your FAFSA. So if you apply for the FAFSA and you don't receive any federal grants, you might still be able to receive grants from a private institution and some public institutions as well. So please keep that in mind, the difference between public and private. And again, as Amy mentioned earlier, it's really, really, really hard to determine in advance, especially when you're looking at the total cost of attendance, just how your situation and your personal situation will be viewed and what your out-of-pocket cost will be to that institution. 2-year and 4-year colleges are also, there's a big difference between those as well. Typically at a 2-year college, you'll be able to earn an associate's degree or earn credit that will transfer to a 4-year college. But I really want to strongly encourage, if students, ultimately, if your end goal is to receive a bachelor's degree or a 4-year college degree, it's really important, if you want to start at a 2-year institution, you can definitely save some money at the beginning, but you need to make sure that if you know where you're going to transfer or you know where you're interested in transferring to, that your college credit will be accepted and that you'll be able to save time in the long run. At some colleges and universities, you might be able to transfer in as a junior, but you might still have 3 years left before you can obtain your degree. Colleges like Xavier require the last 60 credits to be completed at our institution in order to obtain a degree from Xavier University. So it's really important to know that if you want to save money, a 2-year institution can really, really, really be a good option and a good way to reduce your total cost. But it's important to work with a college that you're interested in transferring to, or work with a 2-year institution that has an articulation agreement with a 4-year university so that you know all of your credits will transfer and will work toward a 4-year degree. So keep that in mind too. Regarding special circumstances, which is a term that is used a lot and probably more than ever in the pandemic times, it is considered a special circumstance if your information that is on your FAFSA based from your tax return is not consistent with what is currently happening in your life when you're starting college. So students and families, keep this in mind. As Matt mentioned, the tax return information that you submit on your FAFSA, if you're a senior that's going to be starting college in the fall of 2020, is 2 years old. So it's fall of 22 is 2 years old from the fall of 20 or from the year 2020. So while it might reflect some of the things that happened in your life in 2020, if you lost a job or had a significant loss of income in 2021, that won't be reflected on your FAFSA. So really keep in mind that if you've had a significant loss of income, if you've had significant medical expenses, if your family living situation has changed, maybe your parents are no longer living together and you're living with one parent and they're filing separately, all of these are really, really, really complicated situations. So I strongly encourage students and families to continue to fill out the FAFSA as if you are interested in sending this FAFSA to colleges and universities. But once you file the FAFSA, definitely reach out to the colleges and universities that you're very interested in to let them know, hey, my parent lost their job in 2021 and it's not reflected on the FAFSA information from 2020. Is there a special circumstance form that I can fill out to make sure that my family's financial situation is reflected in the amount of need-based aid I can receive from your college? This is definitely a lot of work, and especially if you're interested in applying to multiple schools, you'll have to call each school individually, each financial aid office individually, but it really can create paint a more accurate picture of what your family's financial situation is, so that we know as colleges that, even though it looks like from 2020 your family income was a lot higher, you actually can't afford to spend as much as it looks like on your FAFSA. It's also important to know that there are some families out there that aren't eligible to file the FAFSA because they can't file a federal tax return. So I always encourage, even if you can file the FAFSA, a great place to start is the net price calculator. So we have a couple of examples of the net price calculator on the next slide, and every college and university, to make it really sweet and confusing, has our own net price calculator. So this is just a quick snapshot of the 3 net price calculators available on Xavier, North Dakota State, and Iowa State's websites. If you are interested in applying to colleges and you're interested in what your out-of-pocket cost could be for your specific student, I strongly encourage you to sort of take a little bit of time to fill out the net price calculator on each college's website. This is something you can do before you apply in some cases. In some cases, you can do it before you file the FAFSA, but it is a good way to get an estimate, again, keyword estimate, of what your out-of-pocket cost will be at each particular institution based on your student and your student's academic merit, as well as your student and your family's financial situation. So on the left here is Xavier's net price calculator. Honestly, the basic net price calculator that we offer is really a scholarship calculator. So we have a significant merit-based scholarship that all students who are admitted are automatically considered for. So you can fill this out as a junior or in the summer before your senior year to get a really good estimate and idea of what our scholarship awarding process is like. So you fill out your information, you can fill out your test score if you have one, you can fill out your GPA, and submit that to get an estimate of what the out-of-pocket cost will be at Xavier. For Iowa State's, which is up on the right side, on the upper right side, it does ask whether or not you're a resident of the state of Iowa, you live full-time in Iowa. It asks whether or not what year in school you are. It also asks whether or not you filed a FAFSA and whether or not you've already received a merit-based scholarship from Iowa State University. So if you're filling out their net price calculator prior to receiving your financial aid award, you might already have some good idea of what your merit scholarship could look like if you're an out-of-state student, to get a really full picture of what your need-based aid based on the FAFSA, as well as your merit-based aid could look like. Additionally, there's a note down at the bottom from NDSU's net price calculator that is really helpful at some institutions. And it'll say, there's definitely a lot to read, but there says specifically that it'll tell you the exact percentage of students at North Dakota State that received financial aid based on their situation. So in 2019, 2020, 78% of students that are full-time received scholarship aid and grant aid. So that's really helpful to know too. You can get a better idea up front before you even do all of this work as to what your financial situation or your out-of-pocket costs could be at these schools. Again, keep in mind, every college is different, every university is different, every family's financial situation is different, and every student's academic situation is different. So this is definitely personal based on you and based on the schools you're planning to apply to. But it's a really good place to start if you're looking for more information now. So with that, everyone take a deep breath. We're going to go ahead and open it up to some questions. Feel free to take a moment to submit any of your questions that you have into the Q&A. Matt and Amy and I are happy to answer any of these questions. Our contact information is also here below. So if you'd like to reach out to us with specific questions, whether or not it's about our particular institution, or if you want to follow up regarding anything that we've mentioned tonight, please don't hesitate to do that. We're happy to help. I did want to share that we did have a question in the Q&A where someone asked how many schools you can send the FAFSA to and whether or not you can do it at multiple times. And I don't know if we mentioned this before, but you can, when you're filing the FAFSA, you can submit it to 10 schools immediately, all at the same time. You can log back into your account. You'll receive an account number. You can log back into your account and submit it to additional schools if you only send it to a couple and your student maybe wants to apply to additional schools later. And I did also look up, it is possible to submit it to more than 10 schools, even though I strongly advise against it, just because applying to more than 10 schools can get to be really, really stressful and hectic for students and families. But if you, there is information I can share in the chat as well about how to go about submitting it to more than 10 schools. You do have to contact FAFSA to do so. So with that, we're happy to answer additional questions that come up. Has anybody seen any more?
I do see a question in the Q&A about work study and just kind of what is work study. And so I think that's something that we should probably tackle, because that is kind of one of the main forms of financial aid that you might be awarded. And so essentially, work study, for kind of all intents and purposes, is a part-time job on campus. And so I think a lot of times the complication about like what work study is can get a little, and the conversations around it can get a little bit confusing. And I think for kind of your purposes as a student, essentially work study doesn't mean a whole lot of like anything different from just having a part-time job on our campus. And so what that could mean is, you know, working at the admission office. Obviously, all of us here work in admissions. We all have student workers in our office, or likely do. You could work at the dining center, you could work at the residence halls, or you could work at the wellness centers. There's plenty of different jobs available on campuses. Now, something to note is not all campuses, or some campuses do have opportunities beyond just work study. And so if you don't receive work study, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't work on campus. It's just something that isn't offered to you directly. Hopefully that makes sense. And Amy and Tara, if you want to add on to that, because I know this topic gets a little bit tricky.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think it's important to clarify, is that it's determined if you're eligible for work study based on your FAFSA. And so not everyone is eligible to have work study as part of their financial aid process. But as Matt mentioned, it doesn't mean that you can't have a part-time job on campus. And so everyone there, again, as I think all three of us have mentioned pretty consistently, again, everyone's situation is going to be a little bit different as far as what that looks like and as far as what that means for you specifically.
Yeah, and I just want to add really quickly, at the institutions that I've worked at, there are some jobs on campus that are work study only, and sub jobs on campus that any student can apply for. Every college is different, and so there are basically work study money, I believe, is sent to the colleges and universities to help subsidize that student's employment on campus. So it is advantageous for a college to employ work study students because it's less expensive for the university. But you typically, if you have work study on your financial aid, I encourage students to just ask when they're going to apply for a campus job, is this job work study only, or I have work study, how do I use this towards the job?
One last thing I'll mention really quickly, because I know we're coming up on time here. With work study, this isn't money that you are receiving upfront. This is money that you do have to work for. And so if you do see it on your financial aid offer letter, just keep in mind that you are not receiving, $2,000 in work study when you accept the work study offer. You are earning work study money through your employment. So it is kind of like an hourly rate, essentially.
Time is short. I'm so sorry how quickly this is going, but I did want to quick mention that financial aid is typically not based on a student's merit. It is only based on a student's need-based aid. FAFSA is not based on your academics. It is based on your family's financial situation.
I see another question. Are there a particular amount of scholarships that you can apply for? Typically, no. All of us have institutional awards that we offer. And then, of course, if you do want to apply for additional awards outside of that, we talked about some of the external, types of scholarships that you can be eligible for that you might want to consider applying for too. But no, not really.
And again, just to reiterate on that, I would just add into making sure that you're aware of the deadlines. And again, that's what we're here for, your admissions counselors. So if you have questions about the difference between academic merit-based, those institutional scholarships, and the deadlines for those, or priority deadlines, do make sure that you're reaching out directly to your admissions counselors so that we can help you with that, because that's what we're here for.
This is a great question. Sorry, Amy, did you want to answer this about scholarships applying towards freshman year? That is a great question to ask. And again, every scholarship is different. So I think ask that question when you're receiving merit-based scholarship. Is this scholarship good for 4 years or even more than 4 years sometimes, or 8 semesters? And then scholarships that you're applying for, it totally depends. Some of the ones I've seen on FastWeb typically are only good for 1 year. But I definitely, you need to ask, you need to read the fine print.
I would also just add to that really quick, Tara, is also understanding what that means. Do I need to maintain a certain GPA? Do I need to make sure I'm in good academic standing, and et cetera, to keep and maintain that scholarship, especially if it is one that should roll from year 1 to 2 to 3 to 4.
One last thing too, just since it's kind of relating to this, and I believe we may have mentioned it, but I'm not totally for sure. You do need to fill out the FAFSA each year that you are attending college. So, fill it out in your senior year, but also, of course, fill it out in your first year of college, second year, third year, so on. So.
Thank you all for being here. I think we're going to turn it back over to Christopher at this point in time. But again, thank you. We hope this was helpful as a brief overview of the financial aid process and paying for college. Certainly wish all of you the best of luck. And again, don't hesitate to reach out to your admissions counselors and the financial aid offices within all of our institutions. So thank you so much. Have a great evening and best of luck to you.
And thank you to our great presenters tonight. It's nice to have folks who know what they're talking about give a good overview of paying for college. So thank you very much. I'm sure all the attendees enjoyed hearing from you, and I just want to echo what they said. Do reach out. I'm sure all of them would be happy to continue the conversation. Before we close this session, just a few quick housekeeping items. The first is that you will receive a very quick 5-question survey that we ask that you complete. And again, there are other sessions. This is just the first of 3 days. I think all 3 of these institutions will be presenting about their schools in the 6x6 session. So definitely sign up for those if you haven't already done so. And there will be some additional panels. And a recording of the session will be available at the strivescan.com/Minnesota website. But thank you again to everybody and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.